welcome to another MassMEDIC event. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Rachel Robinson, Vice President of MassMEDIC, and it's a real pleasure to see all of you again. I know a lot of the faces in the crowd, so thanks for being a great supporter of all of our events. You're in for a treat today. Big shout out to Milliman for putting this incredible presentation together, and I know you're going to learn a lot. Just a few things before we get started, quick reminders. Please keep yourself on mute so there's no background noise for the speakers, but questions are absolutely encouraged. The chat function at the bottom of your screen, please pump questions into those as you go throughout the presentation. The speakers will be stopping to answer some of those at different points in time, so feel free to put those in there throughout the presentation, and then we'll go from there. So I think that's all I have. So I would love to introduce you to Dave Williams and Jeff Jung, who are going to give us a really fantastic presentation. Dave, it's all you.
Thank you. Thank you. And it really is a pleasure to be here. We're excited, and especially to be able to present to you as a team. Jeff and I have worked together for several years, and we have enjoyed our collaborations. And today, we would like to, after our introductions, present as a team, client and vendor, to kind of give a flavor for how the interaction works. So the first part, the first few bullets are going to be rapid fire. Why would you use an actuary? What's an actuary? Introduce the topic, look at some of the data that we use, and then we're going to spend the bulk of the time in this back and forth session between Jeff and I on 5 considerations when you would use this type of data or use a vendor to help. So that's sort of the outline of where we're going today and what to expect. So Jeff, I'll start in my introductions, and I'll let Jeff introduce himself. I'm not an actuary, but I play one on TV sometimes. I do some work with Milliman, who is an actuarial firm, but we hire data scientists and data managers and clinicians and a number of different other types of consultants. I'm primarily in the big data and the outcomes research area, and use this data to help clients and support them in their endeavors to understand what's happening to their patients. So we look at the patient journey and determine how that might be able to inform our clients in their use. So, and I'll let Jeff introduce himself really briefly.
Thanks, Dave. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Jeff Jung. I have about a 20-year history in medical device, both for large manufacturers and most recently with an epilepsy startup, which we'll talk about, uses the base of a lot of the case study examples today, but then involved with everything from negotiating contracts with managed care companies, getting coverage policy set up, dealing with the assessment, both external and internal committees, case management, developing tools and guidelines for them, and then most recently dealing with CMS in this last role that I had. We had to develop new CPT codes. We had to meet with CMS to understand how our new technology, which was cleared through the FDA de novo process, how that would fit into the reimbursement world and try and get that in there. So it was a lot of new great experience on how you take something completely new and try and get it through the reimbursement channels in the complex U.S. healthcare system. So excited to be here today, share experience, and answer any questions that I'm able to.
So some of you were at our last, we did a presentation back, I think it was November, and you may have seen, if you were there, you saw this slide about who was Milliman. For those that are new, many of you may not be familiar with Milliman. We're a large actuarial firm, one of the largest firms in the world. We have about 1,000 healthcare actuaries and consultants in the healthcare area in the US. We work extensively with the largest healthcare companies and some of the smallest healthcare companies, and we help them with their efforts. Essentially what we do is we take real world data, we assess financial risk, and then we have methods that we apply to look at the financial impact of future outcomes. That's kind of us in a nutshell. But we're excited to be able to work in the device manufacturing and pharmaceutical areas. We think there's a lot to be offered here. Just really quickly, kind of going from left to right, I'm going to focus more on the right here. Our health actuaries, we use a lot of historical experience, and I'll show you what some of that looks like very briefly. Risk adjustment is a big part of what we do. We understand what drives the risk of a patient and the various aspects of a patient's profile. That goes into predictive modeling. We also do a lot of what we call disruption analysis. So if you have a device that is likely to disrupt the market and to something that will displace emergency room visits or hospital visits, or maybe add some additional cost of care, we have the ability to look at that and see what's going on. We do a lot of return on investment evaluations, for example, for disease management programs. It's one of the things we do a lot of. So what data do we use? We have population-based data. So we start with a population of people. We have about 50 million commercial lives, and I'll go through this in a minute. Not every member will always have a claim, so there might be 7 to 10% of the population that doesn't exist in the claims portion of the data that we have. But we know about their profile, and we can build population-based models off of what we do. The membership also has some elements of demographics in it. One thing that's missing that is up and coming and will be emerging are things like race, socioeconomic types of things, but that's another piece of the membership that we're looking at. We also have the risk levels, as I mentioned, of the patients. So we run these claims through and augment it and figure out what their risk levels are and what the drivers of those are. And then from that, we can develop benchmarks and disease-specific profiles of patients. And as we go through our case study, you'll see sort of how that emerges. The assets that we're working with include our own Milliman data sets, which have about 50 million people, including Medicare Advantage, Managed Medicaid, individual market. So that's a rich database that is very useful. We also purchased the market scan data, which you may be familiar with about 30 million. An interesting dynamic in this is that our databases are emerging and growing right now. And we are primarily, our data suppliers are primarily large and medium-sized insurance companies. The market scan data is primarily from employer groups, self-insured employer groups. And that particular market seems to be shrinking right now. So as the market scan sort of struggles with their data acquisition, and ours is up and coming, between the two of them, we do have like 80 million people that we can use, but the dynamics are changing a little bit in the marketplace. We subscribe as to the standard analytical files for CMS, both 5 and 100%, and those are used. The 100% is the facility Part A data. The 5%, it also includes the 5% includes the facility data Part A, but also the physician Part B data. We also have the Part B data to use for some research, and we have a smattering of state discharge data sets that include all of the hospital admissions for certain states that we can look at. So what's in that data? There's lots, and we could spend 2 or 3 hours, or if you really want 2 or 3 days, talking about all the different things that are inside the database. So I'm not going to cover this particular, but I will accompany this slide as you look at it with a short story. This was another engagement a long time ago with Jeff in the days of the wound vac. And one of the things we wanted to look at was the effectiveness of the wound vac. So the question was, could we use this data for clinical type of study? And what we did is we used the CPT codes for debridement. And we looked at the depth of debridement. There's 5 codes there, and each code has a different level of debridement that happens in a wound. And we could do that to stratify the data, and we'll talk about stratification a little bit later, to look at the various risk profiles of a patient with diabetic feet and whether or not the wound vac could prevent an amputation. And then by stratifying the data in that way and seeing where the vac would be applied and most effective, we could then do a clinical study for the effectiveness of the vac. If we would have done it just by identifying patients that had diabetes, it would have been too broad and too detailed. But by stratifying it using the debridement wounds, we were able to do something meaningful in the clinical space, and that ended up as a published paper that also was in support of many of the payer decisions that were made later on. So that it turned out to be an important study for them. So at what stage do you look at real world data? And Jeff, I've already forgotten. Are you starting here, or do you want me to take this slide?
No, go ahead, Dave. So
this is one of the questions that we often get when we're working with a device manufacturer, particularly a small one, is at what stage should we start? We're in preclinical research. We're trying to decide kind of how to set up our trials in support for our pre-market application. Is that when I engage you, or do we wait till the trials are over, or do we wait for the full market launch? So just a couple of comments here about where things can be useful. Any of these places, we've been engaged with all of these places to some extent. Typically, we are somewhere close to market trial as you're getting ready for coverage determination. And that's when you're playing offense at this point. You're trying to figure out what your profile of patients looks like. We do an internal study first, and then we may do one that's designed for your target payers. And you're in prep stage for billing and market launch. So that's kind of the middle green arrow. And that leads to then the value demonstration, and you're giving that to CMS and technology committees, and you've got a sales deck that supports that with the value and effectiveness of the product. If you wait to engage us until after full market launch, it's usually because people are questioning your statements of value, and so now you're playing defense, and you need somebody to come in and defend what it is that you think. And sometimes their concerns may be valid, and as an independent consultant, we may have the difficulty of presenting bad news based on the analysis that we would do. So hopefully that would never be the case. But if you wait until that part to engage us, it's usually to play defense. The other reason you would engage us after full market launch is because you're getting pushback on your value, and you're being told to go at risk for your statements of value, in which case you probably need an actuary to assess what risk you're taking and design an appropriate risk taking mechanism to put it in place. So going all the way back to the beginning, why would you ever engage us clear back in the pre-trial research prototype stage? And the answer there is that it can inform you when you're developing your trials about characteristics of the patients that you may not be fully appreciating. And so you have a fuller picture in claims data. It's real world, messy patient data. And by exploring that a little bit, you may discover things that you didn't really understand completely about the patient that you might want to include as a endpoint or as a consideration when you develop your trials. It'll save you the heartbreak of having failed trials or of having difficult trials that take longer to proceed than what you had anticipated. So sometimes that can be useful depending on your situation, depending on your disease that you're trying to manage, and depending on the device that you're trying to develop.
Dave,
yeah.
Let me jump in. So for my case specifically with this, again, it was back in 2014, 2015 with this epilepsy device startup. Our product was a new diagnostic that was using a different body signal other than EEG. It was the first one to get through the FDA that didn't use EEG as a signal for diagnostic use in people with epilepsy and what are called motor seizures, those with movement associated with the muscle component associated with it. And we had engaged with Milliman just to start to try and understand how would we even tell the value story to a payer. And so we were doing a lot of exploratory, looking at the clinical data, looking at the health economic data was out there. How might we position this? And along the way, the issue came up of how would we even get this coded to get reimbursed. And so we wound up going to CMS as part of that and presenting our data, what we had from our pivotal trial, which was already in process. And CMS was, really, you can get these informal meetings with them that last about an hour, and you just petition them and you can get in there. And to reinforce what Dave said, CMS told us, look, the pivotal trial and your endpoints there are for safety and efficacy. It doesn't tell us anything about the outcome or what the effect was or what the clinical benefit was. And not surprisingly, they were looking at things like, tell us what this can do to help keep people out of the hospital, keep people out of the emergency room, those kinds of metrics. And so what it did is our pivotal trial was already going on, but it opened our eyes to, number one, that we were going to be in the CPT world, not the HCPCS world, which is useful. And number two, they told us what kinds of outcomes endpoints they needed to be able to help make coverage decisions. And so for all of our studies going forward, we built those into our protocols. So while we were collecting the clinical evidence, we were also able to collect the outcomes evidence at the same time. So by the time on this chart, when you get to coverage determination, you don't have to scramble so much to try and figure out the value story. You've already got it captured in a well-designed clinical trial.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. That's a good recap of kind of how that was used in this particular case. So regarding that, and Jeff sort of introduced it a little bit, is before you study your target customers, you need to kind of get to know them, get up close to them and ask them questions. And also to put yourself in the perspective of the payer, the hospital, the insurer, CMS, Medicaid, and try to see them through their eyes, so that as you go through this journey of development, then you can sort of begin to anticipate the kinds of questions you're going to have to field later down the process. And then a good one is how do you think this is going to end up getting paid for? And it will be different. We'll talk about this. It'll be different for each payer type. So the case study that we're introducing is, as Jeff mentioned, it's a wearable device that monitors patients who experience seizures as a startup. So that's the device that primarily that we'll be using in this case study. And we would like to go through 5 considerations, and we'd like to bounce back and forth between the device manufacturer's perspective, sort of Jeff's perspective of what he thinks he needs as he's going through his journey of development, and then again from the payer's perspective, which we have great insight to, about how they are going to perceive this device and what they need to know in order to pay for it. So that we're going to go through both perspectives. We'll bounce back and forth. Some of this may be a little scripted, but most of this is just going to be talking between ourselves. So with that, let's talk about the market size. And you need to carefully define your population.
Great. So again, at this startup, my role was Vice President of Marketing and Reimbursement, and then I also moved into general management responsibilities. So as a device manufacturer, at launch, there are some things that you are typically asked to, or a way that companies typically think about market size, market opportunity, and targeting. So the first is sort of the market opportunity, right? Who wants to know that? Our boards do, our CEO does, potential investors, they want to know how big this is. So you start with your funnel at the big, and then draw down to your target. So for us in epilepsy, there are 3.4 million people with epilepsy in the US. It's the 4th most prevalent neurological condition in the US. And then from there, we start to drill down a little bit further. Go to the next slide, please, Dave. So as we looked at, okay, well, who would our diagnostic device help? It's really looking at people who have uncontrolled seizures, who are refractory to drugs. And so, we started to look at, well, how many people are not controlled after the first anti-seizure medication or the second or the third, right? And then you start to drill down in your modeling to say, okay, well, if this is our opportunity, who is it that we're really targeting? Who have these unmet clinical needs? Who are the target patient populations within that? How do you characterize that? How big is the problem? What's the burden of disease, right? And then you can start to get into, well, here are our targets, working with finance, and you start to come up with penetration models and uptake on your device. So that's all good for getting started and helping to scope your market entry and your market, how you want to go to market. But if you've got a significant need to have payers, third-party payers pay for your device, that isn't the full story. And this is where looking at this from a payer perspective is really critical for success.
So Jeff went through this part, got to this far with his sort of thinking in terms of controlled and not controlled. But then we wanted to segment the data even further and start talking about the various different types of seizures that happen. And there's actually quite a few. Grand mal, motor seizures, post-traumatic seizures, non-motor seizures, other convulsions, fever, convulsions due to fever. And then one that is our favorite but is really hard to work with is psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, which are not really seizures at all, but they present as if they are. And so going back to Jeff's prior slide, he's really working this area of the non-controlled group, which we sort of highlight here, in the green circled areas. So there may have been, we see they had 3.4 million people, and we went back and forth on exactly what the market size should be. When we sort of broke it down into various categories, we're not far off of 3 million, depending on the variances that might occur. But in terms of the target for the device, you're really in these intractable areas, which shrinks the population a little bit down a little bit, and helps to understand exactly what the target audience really should look like. We also further break it down into the silos for Medicare, aged and disabled, which are two different populations. And you can see that the disabled population actually is different than the Medicare age population. So that was also informative. Then your Medicaid population, your commercial data, kind of separated, and you see where those then are segmented and the payer types that are associated with them.
Yeah, Dave, let me jump in real fast on that. So when we went to CMS, one of the questions that CMS had for us was to say, look, our population is 65 and over. We're not sure we even have a lot of people who suffer with epilepsy or uncontrolled seizures. And our argument was, no, these are your people. This is your population. And so, of course, they said, prove it. So we went back and worked with Dave and the team. And one of the really interesting things that we found out was that half of the people who were eligible or could use our diagnostic weren't necessarily the Medicare age population, but it was the Medicare disabled population. And that was a huge breakthrough understanding of who our market was, who we needed to study, and what kind of data we needed to take back to CMS after the studies were done to show them that, yes, there's a significant portion of the Medicare population that this diagnostic is relevant for.
And Paul, I see your question about the different characteristics. This is one of the things that we went through discovery. As we go along, you'll see other characteristics of the patient that will emerge as we start to stratify the data a little bit more. So the tricky part, one of the trickiest parts of a beginning of an engagement with a device manufacturer, with anybody that's looking to target a disease, is getting clear definitions about what we're talking about. And this is an important step for a variety of different reasons. These are procedure codes and ICD-10 codes that we would be using to identify patients in this population. The getting clarity about exactly what codes are working in here will help later on when you get to your pricing mechanisms and identification of the issue when you speak to payers, whether it be CMS or a commercial insurer. Oftentimes, the diseases are not well defined in their mind, and they might think they have a definition. But by putting in the diagnosis codes and making it clear and documenting it, and then showing the numbers behind those diagnosis codes becomes very helpful later down the road, particularly when you get to the pricing discussions. This is not trivial. We went back and forth on this one for several months with several doctors and with several opinions about what this ought to be.
Well, and not only several physicians, but also several coders. Make sure you bring your coders into this discussion. Doctors don't really have a good understanding of how diseases and how their cases actually get coded into what codes. So make sure you're talking to the coding folks, because they're the ones who will help get you balance out your information and get you steered in the right direction.
So then that sort of leads to a discussion about market pricing. And as we mentioned, you're going to have different payer types, Medicare, even Medicare, difference between Medicare for service and Medicare Advantage. Also, the disabled population may be a little different. Your commercial populations are going to be different. Managed Medicaid, which may be different than fee-for-service Medicaid. So you need to, and also there's also hospital considerations. If you're primarily putting your device in a hospital and it's being paid for under a DRG, for example. So different payer types, different places of service will have different prices.
Yeah, and that's a very different discussion than the types of questions that you might normally get asked. That marketing might normally get asked, right? We're asked, how much can I charge? What is the current standard of care cost, right? And to look at that, and then hopefully then you're doing some sort of value analysis. I've always done conjoint studies, to try and define what that price should be, what that value really is, so you can set the right price. Getting that price then converted into a format and into the way that healthcare actually gets paid for using codes. There's a bridge there, and so you've got to be looking at this from the payer perspective and doing those kinds of analyses in addition to your value analysis, your conjoints, if you want to realize the value in your pricing that you'd like to.
And you might find, like, if you're looking at competitors that have similar kinds of products and you're trying to evaluate their pricing, we often will go back and look at those competitive pricing pieces and see the range of reimbursements that are occurring. This is not for the device. This page is not for the device that is specific to this case study. But what it's designed to show is that depending on whether or not this is a rental or a new device or or something else, you could have a range that is quite large. Maybe from the bottom to the top is as much of a twofold difference in what's getting charged or what's getting paid. So what you want to do is you want to kind of understand the competitive layout of the marketplace by payer type and understand what the value that they're receiving. If this is a de novo device, if it's brand new, then it may very well need some creative types of pricing that are based on value, which has a different pricing strategy that would get used. Jeff's was in that kind of category. What could they charge reasonably based on the value of the device? There's really nothing comparable out there to work with. You have people that you need to please in this discussion. It may be a group purchasing organization if you're just going straight to the hospital. You have your technology committees at the health plans that are going to determine whether or not they will actually pay for it if it's brand new and not proven. You may have to do cost-effective studies to demonstrate the effectiveness. In Europe, these are required in many cases, and there's a process, a more specific process about pricing there that needs to be done. We talked about that at our last session. And then getting a code. If your device doesn't have a code associated with it, and Jeff can speak a little bit to this as he already has, is getting that code can be challenging. And it's an important piece because if you don't have a code, you can't bill. So these empty chair technology committees, faceless people that make these decisions, are the important ones to please. Market segmentation. And by the way, as we go through these, if you do have questions, take a brief pause here. Please post the questions. We're more than happy to try to answer them. And Paul, I hope we're answering the questions about the different characteristics. There's more down the road here. But please post your questions as we go on. So market segmentation just talks about breaking down the population into various different categories of all kinds. To look at the granularity is an important piece. There's a tendency to think that all of your children are beautiful, and you know, if it's your child, then it's always going to be beautiful, and it's worth an infinite amount, and people will pay an infinite amount. It's like Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. But when you start breaking it down into the data, then you'll find various characteristics that would probably need to be addressed. It helps you in your clinical understanding of the patient, the target, similar to the way we broke it down before, and helps you to understand, you know, exactly where this device is going to be used and how effective it might be. There's another tendency when you talk to doctors and their patient panels. My patients are always sicker than yours, which means that they can, you know, they're worth more. So there's that line of thinking that goes on, but breaking it down in the data really helps to anticipate and consider in the targets. So going back to this slide, if you look at the seizure categories on the left, these are ordered in level of severity, and that level of severity, the hierarchy of severity, was done as a joint decision between Jeff's team and our team, and there is no patient that falls into two categories. So if they had a grand mal seizure, they go to the top category, even if they had previously diagnoses that fell into non-motor seizures or post-traumatic seizures or other categories. And there were many that fell into multiple categories, but if they bubbled up to, you know, to the top one, that's where they went. By doing that in the segmentation, then we're able to more clearly define various aspects of where to place the device, how to price for it. It also is a jumping off place for risk stratification. Going back to my previous example of the wound vac and being able to determine where the wound vac was effective in preventing diabetic foot amputations, if you look at the distribution of risk within one of these buckets, so if you took, for instance, the grand mal intractable bucket or the motor seizure not intractable, and then you broke that down into risk categories, you would have a wide range of risk and comorbidities with patients that would exist within that bucket. And by breaking those down, you can further segment the market to determine how effective the product might be. And we do that using, using our risk score methods that also include the clinical drivers for what those risk scores would look like. So if a patient had a risk score of 10, where the normal population would be 1, so the relative risk is 10 times more risky, then we would also have the clinical drivers that would define that, part of which may be seizure, but they may also have characteristics like a heart condition or or diabetes, typically, or other conditions that may be compounding the effects of the seizures that also contribute to the risk of the patient.
So here's a case example how we put this in use at Brain Sentinel. So for market entry, what are we typically looking at? We're looking at where can we get scripts? How do we look at the physicians who might be prescribing our device and using it, place of service, and essentially sort of where is the greatest value proposition. And depending on if you're at a bigger or smaller company, you might launch in all those places at once, or you might have to pick them. So while we were looking at market entry, one of the areas that we thought we had a pretty good value proposition was in the acute care setting. So if somebody gets admitted to the floor, either because of a breakthrough seizure, or maybe they're in for something else, but they have epilepsy and they have seizures, we thought we had a value proposition to say, hey, people with epilepsy are more comorbid, significantly more comorbid than the general population. And frankly, there was data that Dave and the team put together for us to show us that, which was very insightful. So we thought, well, if you can manage these patients on the floor with our device and they have seizures while they're in hospital, that would then be a clear indication that these people are sicker and have a higher acuity level than other patients. And using the MCC, and now I'm blanking, Dave.
Major complications.
Major complications. Thank you. Could a hospital then turn around to their payer and say, hey, this patient is sicker, therefore we should get a higher reimbursement? We thought we were onto something here. And so the data that Milliman pulled for us showed that people without an MCC, without a major complication, got reimbursed on average. This was, I think, 2014-15 data, $6,700, versus if they had seizures with a complication, major complication, they got reimbursed $12,000 for that stay in the hospital. So we thought we were onto something here, and we had a clear value proposition. Because if not, our potential customers were telling us, if you can't figure out a way for us to get this paid for, you're just another line item on our cost to care for these patients, and our margins can't afford that. So then the next part of this analysis was to see, okay, well, how do you measure MCC, and how do you then get classified with the major complication? And it turned out at the time, Milliman looked into this for us, CMS publishes a list of these complications, and seizure was not one of the categories that put you into the MCC. So it had the effect of destroying our value proposition, and we weren't able to go into the acute care setting at the time of our launch. While very disappointing, because we really thought we had something that was going to improve outcomes for the patient, going to help out the hospitals, and align with our launch. We found out before we launched, not after we launched. So it saved us an embarrassing launch, as disappointing as the data were for us.
So on to the next section, benchmarks and utilization. So the way Jeff, when he came to us with this part of it, he was thinking of it in terms of what percentage of a physician's practice would use my device. So if I'm a neuro a physician, what percentage of my patients are seizure patients, basically, and what clinical standards would I be using? And which was great. We could help him with that, and I think that's an important piece of it, because it helped him to understand how to talk to the doctors, and how much of a burden working with patients was for the doctors, and how this might help them. We would look at it more going back to the population based, at a utilization per thousand, average cost per service, and per member per month point of view. More like, we're actuaries, we think like actuaries, we present information like actuaries. So that's sort of the difference in kind of the way we would look at things. Both perspectives we can provide both perspectives, but I think we expand the perspective a little bit when you think about it from a population-based perspective.
So in this example, without having, so again, this was a new device without any history. So how do we get started in terms of talking to payers? How do we get in there? And there was a small pitch deck that I had to try and get the attention of managed care. So this pitch deck was designed for managed care medical directors as well as VPs of contracting. And one of the slides that I had in there to try and highlight for them the cost of epilepsy. You know, if you're in, you know, diabetes or heart disease or some of these others, you have payers' full attention because those patients cost the payers a lot of money. If you're in something like epilepsy, you kind of fall down in the middle of the chain, and it's a little bit harder to get their attention to get started. So I used existing peer-reviewed literature, and I understand this is a bit of an eye chart, but there had been a retrospective meta-analysis they conducted looking at what are the costs to a payer for somebody who has uncontrolled epilepsy versus controlled epilepsy. And not surprisingly, the headline was controlled epilepsy costs you less than uncontrolled epilepsy. And this has some credibility because it was third party, it wasn't our data, it was science-based. And, you know, I said, this is what the collective we already know. And so what drives the cost of refractory patients being more expensive for refractory members? And there were, one is people who have controlled epilepsy have fewer inpatient stays. They are controlled through medication, so their medication costs tend to be higher. The column says AEDs, anti-epileptic drugs. That cost shift goes to AEDs, which you would expect. And then you also have a higher percent of outpatient stays when you're controlled versus uncontrolled because you're not going into the ER or to the inpatient. And then, of course, this then heat up, well, our solution is our diagnostic can help you improve these outcomes and reduce costs. So those payers that fit said, okay, let's prove that. So there are two ways that you can prove that then. One is your clinical studies, which I talked about earlier, and making sure that you've got the outcomes that you're capturing along with your clinical data so you can have that case to show. And second, you can do a claims analysis based on a specific payer claims history. And by using ICD-9, ICD-10 codes, other codes that are out there to create a statistical universe that can be analyzed to try and reproduce data like this in their real world.
I'm going to skip to this slide. So when we broke it down by the various seizure types, so remember the things that were on the left in the previous slides are now across the top. Your grand mal seizures, intractable motor, other convulsions, febrile. And what this does is it shows you the per member per month costs in each of these buckets compared to what we would call a standard commercial population. So at the bottom, you have your $343 PMPM. This is from a few years ago, so that's, if anybody's interested, the PMPM value is quite a bit higher now. But it also breaks it down into the inpatient, outpatient facility, professional, pharmacy, other categories. So you can go through each of the seizure types, the grand mal, for example, and show that it is well in excess of 10 times higher than your standard population. And this then, it also kind of gives you a flavor for how many people are in there. So this starts to get to the proverbial, 5% of your population is driving 80% of your cost, the Pareto principle. And it shows that, what it shows is that patients with certain types of seizures that are occurring, just how expensive they are compared to the rest of the population, and what percentage of the population they represent. This population-based statistic resonates more with a commercial payer who has to contract with doctors or has to develop pricing algorithms or has to develop disease management programs to address these patients, because it allows them to see where it fits into the total scheme of what they're doing. And it's presented in a way that they already think in. The clinician in the room will think more like what Jeff presented and think more about it from the clinical perspective. you sort of need both if you're going into a payer type to help them to understand it. And I think that it's important that the population-based statistic that is broken down in the same pricing mechanisms be developed for your pricing and value proposition when you're talking to these folks. So hopefully that kind of gives you a flavor for the difference there. In market disruption, what's the potential value compared to the standard of care is sort of just perspective. And then we're again trying to look at the full picture.
So this is the way that we developed over time to talk about our value to payers, and sort of walking through it. What it says is, look, you've got a whole group of patients out there who are uncontrolled, who have uncontrolled seizures after failing 2 anti-epileptic drugs, anti-seizure drugs, and they're costing you on average $38,000 a year. Using our system, which is called the Speak system, you can better analyze those patients and the events that they're having, and that will then put those patients into 2 buckets. The first bucket are 80% of the people who are having true epileptic events, and if you can have better understanding about their seizures and their time and their frequency, you can have a better chance of getting them under control. And if you get those seizures under control, their costs will drop to an average of $18,000 a year. So, you know, more than half. The other bucket of patients are folks who aren't actually having epileptic seizures at all. And the literature tells us that's about 20% of the people who are currently considered refractory to medication. If you now change their diagnosis away from having epilepsy to now having these psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, their cost drops to $1,500 a year, which is a huge cost savings. So we had this as the framing for our value for payers, and then with data from our clinical studies, plus data from claims analyses, that was in how we were building the story and the evidence over time to go back to payers. So once we had a code that we were having, a CPT code that we were marching towards, then we could use these data to help us with coverage decisions and pricing decisions.
So
and something like this, you know, like I said, this took us years. It's a simplified chart, but it took us a lot of years, a lot of understanding, a lot of back and forth, experience in the field with the device and what it could do, you know, feedback from our own clinical studies over time to create this. So we, you know, especially with a new technology, we didn't have the benefit of an analog. You know, it took us a while to come up with this.
So going back to the original slide where we sort of talked about at what point do you engage it, to kind of conclude that last point, and two thoughts about how it connects well. The disruption of a product is, you can see a contrast, the use of a product, the total profile of a patient with the use of a product and without the use of the product, if it's been in existence for a couple of years, and you can see the profile of the patients pre and post. That was the case when we did the wound vac study on the diabetic feet. That had been being built in the data for long enough that we could identify people with a wound vac, and we could look at what portion of them were saving those amputations compared to those that were not put on the vac. So that history, as Jeff mentioned, takes a while to develop. In the case where you're have a new device and you're trying to estimate the disruptive pieces of it, if you engage early on in the process in the preclinical trial, and your outcomes, your trials have endpoints that can help you to reflect on the difference, then you can also measure it that way through the trials. Things like focus groups and Delphi panels are difficult for people to understand. You can do things like that to get a sense of it, but they're difficult for people to accept because they're not totally scientific in nature. Another example is if you have a device and you're doing a outcomes research, and part of your trial is, did this perform better than another product that's out there? Say it's maybe a stent or something like that. then you can also use that information from the clinical trial and apply that to the claims data, such that then you can estimate the cost within the claims data for the differences that are occurred between the two different devices, where this one performed better than this one. And so by using the information and the endpoints from the clinical trials and saying that your revascularizations were less than the competitive device, you can then quantify that in real terms using the claims data to estimate what the cost impact would be, as an example. So that sort of concludes our study. We're about 10 minutes in. Are there any questions that we can answer for you last little bit? And I should show the famous disclaimers from Milliman in case you wanted to read those.
Seems like there's no other questions coming in. I'm going to make sure we give everybody, we do have a few minutes. You know, there's been obviously a ton of information in this webinar, and it's been fantastic. So, you know, oh, great. So what should people be doing next to get in touch with you? So that's definitely a question that's coming in. So slides, can we share these slides afterwards with the group, David?
Yes, we'd be happy to share the slides. We may present a redacted one with some of the data in there. The data is as an example, but we worry a little bit about somebody taking it and trying to use it. So we may take some of the actual data out, but the key contact will be in there.
No worries. Okay, and we did actually have a couple questions come in through the chat. So did you want me to read those off to you, or you've got those?
Oh, no, I've got them. So did any of your data lead to consider alternate payment models, service models, or is it best to stick to device charge and other charge? So Jeff, I think that one's for you.
Yeah. So for us, it did not, Jim, lead us to looking at alternative payment models. We had discussed it, but again, we went back to our discussions with CMS as well as with our professional society, and really relied on them to give us, you know, some guidance on that. Where we started was we thought we were going to be a HCPCS in that category, and then when CMS at our second meeting with them, they said no, it would be in CPT, in the CPT world. We kind of went with that, and as we engaged with our professional society, who was going to help guide us through that process, they concurred, and alternative payment did not come up. And also, I think part of that is just due to the way epilepsy care is delivered in this country. There wasn't a clear, easy way for us to carve something like that out.
So Angela, you asked a question in relation to that about some of the differences between CMS and commercial payment. And just a couple of quick comments on that. CMS will have their own method for evaluating the product and give you a price. And that the way they come up with that price will be a combination of understanding the value of the product, what other people might be charging, and any other objective information that might come up. There also might be prospective payment systems that involve RVUs or other valuation tools that they use to come up with a price. When you look at it from a commercial perspective, it's more a matter of what you can negotiate with your individual payers and managed care companies. So that becomes an exercise in negotiation. One of the first steps you have to go through is the technology committee to get it on their coverage, so that you make sure that it's a covered benefit, and not still in the experimental stage. And then you offer your value propositions and your pricing. Typically, commercial pricing relative to Medicare can be anywhere from 1.5 times to 5 times difference in pricing. So typically the commercial pricing is a little bit higher Medicaid is a little bit lower than Medicare, typically in its relationship. Not always, but typically is. And then various other streams like managed Medicaid, managed Medicare, Medicare Advantage are also negotiated with the vendors that are working with that. So hopefully that gives you a little brief piece of the landscape.
Let me just add on to what you said, Dave. So one of the things that CMS is very clear on is when they make their coverage decisions, they will tell you that they do not take into account health economic pricing considerations. They base it on the merits of the clinical data and of the outcomes. But when you talk about the outcomes, the data that they're looking at all have an economic impact, right? We all know if there's fewer ER visits, if there's fewer inpatient stays, those kinds of things, that will drive down costs, and they're looking at it. So they have their way of inserting that into the equation, but they will tell you that they don't look at the economic benefit at all when making those coverage decisions.
Right. So another question related to that are what are things, Eric, these are called ICER studies that can emerge. And this is a whole topic that we could dive into for a couple of hours later on, but generally speaking, for medical devices, ICER studies are not as interesting in the US. They are more interesting for pharmaceutical than they are for devices. And they're big in Europe. They tend to be bigger and sometimes required in Europe. Another question from Eric.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead, Jeff.
No, go ahead. I was looking at Eric's second question there. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the question from Eric is that, actually from Paul again, how do we work differently from startups? And I should have introduced this a little more carefully. But this, as you can tell, this presentation, I think, has more relevance to small and emerging device manufacturing companies. For big companies, they have a health economics outcomes research division where they have typically the Medicare data, sometimes the Truven data, if they're really big, and other data sources that they can use to inform the device manufacturing process as they go along. As a small or medium-sized company, you're at a bit of a disadvantage without that resource available to you to go through these discovery sessions with the data. And so you're at that disadvantage if you can afford it, which we understand is an issue for small companies, then it will help level the playing field a little bit with the other devices when you get to the point of launch and ready to get those pricing points in place. So just I think that we probably should have mentioned that a little bit more up front. But if you're a big company and you already have this division, then where you might use somebody like a Milliman is to help you with more complex pricing and independent research. Because if it's coming from within, it's often looked at with a little bit of a biased, anticipating that there's a bias that involves there. So getting the independent view is helpful. And also if you want to take risks, sometimes it's helpful to get that understanding. So different tasks for different size companies.
On Eric's question about dollars saved by providers as sole consideration pricing, or does improvement to quality of life come into the equation? From a payer perspective, we had feedback. We did a dry run of a model that that Milliman developed for us with a payer. And a couple of notes on that. One, as soon as they saw that Milliman's name was on the work, there was sort of a credibility that came with the model that we were presenting because they knew about Milliman standards and their reputation. So that was very helpful. Also, some of the data that Dave presented today in terms of how sick these people with epilepsy were, not even the payer understood that because they're not looking at these populations. So if you're in an area with patients that aren't well understood by payers, they probably don't know their costs. So having some of these kinds of data are very helpful and instructive for them to highlight that. But one of the things that they came up with, and this particular payer did a lot of work with employers as well as a lot of workers' comp. And what they told us, they said, depending on how this goes, if you have quality of life data, yes, they would like to see it. But they said if the quality of life data and how these people could recover or get their lives back under control by having their seizures under control, that gets them back to their life faster. Even if the ROI was just 1 for 1 and there wasn't really much of an ROI, they said from a quality of life standpoint, that might actually be a reason for us to cover and pay for this, you know, in addition to the clinical benefits. So it is there. That data is much harder to capture. You can build it into your clinical studies, and you should look at that. And if you need to do any coding work to have codes created or modified for you, that data certainly plays well with the CPT panel that's run by the American Medical Association.
So for the record, that was not a paid advertisement for Milliman, by the way. So Rachel, I think we're out of time, and I think we've exhausted the questions. So
yeah, it's perfect timing. So thanks everyone for joining us. David, Jeff, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to share this information. And I will make sure that everyone on the call gets your contact info so that if there's questions, they can reach out individually. Everyone else, have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.
great, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.